Welcome to the Media Leader Podcast. I'm Jack Benjamin.
And I'm Omar Oakes.
And we have a very special podcast for you today. We were just up in Manchester for our inaugural Future of Media Manchester conference. It was an absolute pleasure to get outside the London bubble, meet some new faces, and talk all things media. We're recording this on Friday morning, so we're now back in a very rainy London after we took an evening train home yesterday, and we wanted to share some of our own reflections from the event. So first, Omar, I wanted to ask you to start. What was your top takeaway from Future of Media Manchester?
Oh, it was so good. So we had it at the Royal College of Northern Music, just by the university campus. It was great. It was such a good venue, and as I suspected, it wasn't just a load of London people traveling up to Manchester to just do another Future of Media event like we normally do in London. Completely different crowd. There's so much happening in the north of England and Scotland. So met lots of people who I hadn't met before, and as we'll get into on this episode, lots of issues are raised that we don't normally talk about, and some familiar issues, but it was great. A top takeaway, I mean, funnily enough, we always do this thing at the end of our Future Media conferences where we play this game, Who Wants to Be a Media Leader?
Oh, it's a lot of fun.
And ITV haven't noticed any copyright issues yet, but yeah, so we get a panel of people together. This time we had team publisher and team agency, and we asked them some questions. We quizzed them on some Media Leader recent articles, and it always prompts a really interesting discussion. One question where we were talking about talent, and you shouldn't have this idea that's a very old issue in terms of you shouldn't have to feel like you need to live in London to have a successful media or advertising career. And I think what had been happening before the pandemic is that there was so much SME spend going on digital, and a lot of agencies were setting up shop in the north, and we had the BBC moving to Salford and ITV, Media City, Channel 4 going to Leeds. All this stuff was happening. You really thought there's some momentum. But we actually had some quite negative chat about the prospects for Manchester over the next few years based on what's happened since the pandemic. So Simon Crunden, who's the CEO of Free Thinking Group, is based up in Manchester. He said, quote, "There's a genuine crisis of brands leaving Manchester, specifically to go to London agencies. At the moment in the media industry, I reckon over the last 3 years, about $250 million in media billings has left Manchester."
Wow. I mean, what's causing that? Why would media investment be leaving Manchester, let alone like maybe not coming and being added to Manchester, but why would it leave to go to London?
I think what's been happening, and by the way, these figures were corroborated when I was speaking to people after the event. This was corroborated by a broadcaster who said they're seeing very similar figures. I think what's happened is the not just the broadcasters but media owners have made it much easier to buy television. I think these SMEs have they've scaled up and become a lot bigger and done really well at their digital advertising investments. And there's a need that I think there's a belief among a lot of them that once you get to a certain size, you need to spend more on TV. And if you're going to spend more on TV, then maybe I should really go for that big London-based agency rather than this digital shop that's done very well for me so far. But really, I need that London agency. I'm not going to name names in terms of specifically which agencies have lost money and which agencies have gained money, because we need to independently verify it. But anecdotally, that's specifically why this has happened.
Is there anything to be said as well for if you were a brand looking to get a little bit more of a global market exposure? Is that a reason also to choose London over a Manchester agency, or is that not really a reason that Manchester, or like, because I'm thinking if you were a brand that's trying to get into other European markets, let's say, maybe that could be a reason to be attracted to a London agency?
Possibly that might be true, but that wasn't specifically reasons given when I spoke to people. And the thing about the geography, if you're a different network, it depends on what network you're in, right? So we had Julie Chadwick, who was from Dentsu Creative, on this panel, and she was talking about the fact that they have UK teams in Dentsu. They've got offices all over the country, and she said that they don't, when they work on an account, they try to push their integrated credentials. You might be working on a team based with people who are based in different offices, and it doesn't really matter where you're based. It's just a UK team works on it. Whereas, if you're Publicis Media, you're all in London. They don't have anything. And so that's the only place. If you want to work with Publicis, an agency, then you have to be there. Interesting to see whether that remains, because not everyone wants to work in London. If you want the best talent, maybe you do need to offer things in the north of England as well.
Yeah, I did want to talk as well about talent development, because that was also part of this panel. And it seemed like there was a lack of incentive that was sort of being described to shift talent outside of London, in terms of, it seems like a lot of talent gets shuttled into London from the north, and then people that maybe even want to stay north will still be asked, like, oh, if you're going to accept a promotion, let's say, maybe we heard from Jeff March, who's chief digital officer at GB News, but he used to be a journalist at other publications, and he was talking about how earlier in his career he really wanted to buy a house and settle in Manchester, but he got a promotion that was like, no, you have to be in London to take this job. Is that something that doesn't need to happen as much, but certainly anymore, because you have all this remote work, right? I mean, surely that would allow for maybe more flexibility in location.
Yeah, with online flexible working and just attitudes changing, you would think that should change. But GB News, it's really interesting because they see themselves very much as a northern success story. They talk about their biggest audience growth being in the north of England. Jeff said that they think that most of their audience are Labour supporters rather than reform Faragistes. So the north of England is a heartland for them. It's difficult because, again, going back to something that Julie said on this panel, the infrastructure needs to be massively improved. It's all well and good to say that we should have more stuff happening in the north of England, but if it's actually quicker for you to travel from Manchester to London and back up to Newcastle than it is to go from Manchester to Newcastle, just completely untenable. And there's been such a lack of proper infrastructure planning and investment in this country for too long. And it's because it just seems to be because it's a lot of London-based civil servants, politicians, policymakers who just don't really have an interest in sharing economic prosperity around this country. And my personal opinion is that's why you've had a Brexit. That's why you've had disengagement with politics overall, is because just really short-sighted policies, and our industry is suffering for it.
Yeah, I mean, we even ran into troubles with our own trains in both directions in terms of just delays.
My God.
I mean, and we talked to people, and this was the standard. And not only is it standard that trains can get cancelled between London, Manchester, elsewhere, or otherwise delayed, and that causes inefficiency in terms of business. But there's also no real service. There's no reliable service on the trains. So you're talking about losing potentially 4 hours of your day traveling, where you maybe want to be productive and actually can't be at the moment. So that's also a big issue.
You can get 5G on the Piccadilly line in London Underground, right? You get 5G. I just don't understand where there's zero signal for 2 hours on the train, so you can't do any work while you're traveling as well.
Let's try and improve the vibes, maybe improve the internet service, and people can be more productive. Businesses can be more productive. I think there is definitely a big thing to say about infrastructure improvements. Omar, I'm curious what other takeaways you had from the event, because it wasn't just that last panel, of course. There was loads of other things that were being discussed, including you had a panel with Manchester City Football Club people. Is that right?
That's right. So listeners may not know that Manchester City, a couple of years ago, they set up this, how do you describe it? It's part branded content division, part social influencer agency, part advertising consultancy. Gavin Johnson, media director, and James Wilkins, the ECD there, they were on a panel I hosted to talk about this recent Netflix docuseries they've done, which is called Treble. winners together, treble winners. A few years ago, they did a similar-ish sort of thing on Amazon Prime Video. The interesting difference between the two, though, whereas the Amazon documentary was very much part of a series of documentaries they've done with different sports teams, where it's Amazon, they come in, film it, script it, etc. This Netflix one, Man City had actually done themselves.
It was all in-house.
It was all in-house. So they shot it,
Wow.
they planned it themselves, they shot it themselves, and Netflix was just a distributor. And it's extraordinary. So there was already, when you all these all or nothing things, you're like, oh, how much of it is real when they kind of give you behind the scenes footage, and how much are we really getting the real football star as opposed to something that's scripted. But you think, well, Amazon's doing it, whereas this one, it's like, well, Manchester City's just producing it themselves. And I wonder how many Netflix viewers would know that. I wonder if they did know that, where it would affect their experience. I haven't seen the Netflix one, but I'm going to watch it now because through that lens, and see because I have seen the Amazon one, and this is an interesting development because there are so many sports documentaries, so many high-profile football teams, not just the Premier League but all over the world, who are creating their own content because they've got these amazingly famous stars that they own, right, under contract, and they're becoming so much more media savvy, and there's so much potential to work with brands and to kind of do their own thing through the media. It's a fascinating space.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's so much money to be made. I mean, broadcasters always talk about the importance of live sport. It gives reliable audiences, but there's also this sort of actually quite large now cottage industry around making those sports players stars through other media types. That could include podcasts, that include documentaries, or you end up having some players that retire and then get into media in other ways, right? And it's interesting. I think you even asked at one point, sort of like, are the athletes being treated almost like as actors now because they are so media trained, right? And I can't remember the response. I think there was some pushback. Obviously, there's a level of authenticity that was definitely a buzzword that cropped up in terms of making sure that the athletes are just being their actual selves. But it sounded like they're getting more comfortable on camera over time and really developing these extra skills while they're still players.
Yeah, and we didn't. I mean, there's only limited time. There are a million questions I would like to ask, but one of the questions I didn't ask that would have been interesting is the whole thing about duty of care. So these footballers, they go into it. They're really young, and then they go into this kind of like really high pressure, high performance career, and then you get to your 30s, and at some point you've got to retire. And if you're lucky, if you're playing for Man City, you make a lot of money along the way, become really famous, and you've got all these opportunities. So they have a responsibility to these kids. They are kids, as they kind of are educated, and then kind of how they handle the pressures of fame, high performance, etc. And then a lot of these footballers, they either do it or they want to do it. They go into the media afterwards. And there's a question over whether the football club has a responsibility to train them, to educate them, to help them, to support them psychologically as they become media people. So I think it's really interesting. So they push back on the idea that they're actors, give them acting lessons, and kind of the message for brands was, just don't, expect them to kind of like do a heavily scripted thing. But there is a way to work with them. And I think it creates a lot of opportunities, perhaps for talent agencies that specialize. I'm sure there are that do already, but it's a vibrant industry. And when you think about the rise of women's football, they obviously have a successful women's football team as well. Different sports becoming more popular around the world. Sport is going to become, if it's even possible, it's going to become an even bigger part of the media, I think, over the next 10 to 15 years. What about you, Jack? So you did a couple of panels, and you got to watch a lot of stuff we did in Manchester as well. What was your overall takeaway?
Yeah, I think the overall takeaway across a number of different panels was it seemed like there was a pretty strong sentiment sort of against social media that came out in terms of just spending on social media, or maybe not trusting social media as much as other media channels. And part of me wonders that we probably should have made sure we had more balance in terms of having more social media companies that were there to defend themselves, because it was pretty consistent in terms of, and I think it's also that the conference is coming on the heels of research conducted by Essence Mediacom that said that brands were spending perhaps 3 times more than is optimal on social media. And you can listen. We did a podcast with Richard Kirk from Essence Mediacom, who talked about that. But there was, of course, some nuance in terms of, okay, there's lots of reasons to use social. It might not be that we are spending too much, but that we aren't spending in the right way on social as well. I mean, that was also sort of the nuance of the discussion. But I just thought that was particularly interesting. And I don't know if I could point to, there wasn't one panel that was just like, let's talk about social media. It was just consistent across many different panels, whether it's related to measurement or effectiveness.
There were some interesting discussions about that because because I hosted a panel of brand marketers, one from Shoe, one from N Brown, one from Sherwin-Williams, they do Bronxill and Valspar, and very different sorts of brands. But when you ask them specifically about the media plan and strategy, and again, other comments when you put this question to them, I was like, are you spending too much on social? It's kind of like, well, it depends. It depends what our brand is. It depends who we're trying to reach. It just depends on our particular campaign. But the Essence Mediacom research is trying to aggregate brand behavior. And so it's seeing on an aggregate level, there may be an overspend on social.
How useful is that for an individual brand, right?
Well, yeah, so it's fine to say that an individual brand as a data point is going to be somewhere on that graph, right? But it's still, the implication is still that there are too many brands who are spending too much. So I'm interested to find out, well, who are these brands that are spending too much? So there was a good panel on TV specifically that friend of the media leader, Rachel Forward, formerly UK CEO, hosted. And you had Sam Taylor. We talked about Sam Taylor recently because he's wrote a piece for the media leader on Origin last week. Sam Taylor, marketer for Direct Line. And his response to that was, quote, no shit. No shit. Some brands have, in the last few years been spending too much on social. But as, we get better at measuring effectiveness, we're actually seeing that, okay, maybe we need to draw that down a bit. There's no doubt that TV is not just a more effective medium compared to social display channels. It's not even close, he said. But he made a really interesting point, actually. He was saying that if we're having this discussion about effectiveness like 5 years ago, you'd be willing to say, well, I can't really measure how effective my TV advertising is, but I know independent research that it is very effective. So I'm willing to have a lot of wastage, because if I just book a big TV campaign and I can't necessarily measure the response from it, I know that it's way more it's efficient and effective enough that it doesn't matter if loads of people didn't see my ad, because enough people are seeing it because the reach is so big,
right?
Compared to quite expensive targeting that you might have to do on digital platforms, right? He said that there's actually now maybe a tipping point with that, where we have much more quality data, much more better marketing mix modeling, better use of clean rooms where you can mix different data sets together, where actually that expensive targeting, it might be a lot better to do that, which has implications for whether big brands going forward will want to do as much spray and pray, quote unquote, reach. So that's quite interesting. I suspect it was kind of one of the predictions from that panel was that a lot more brands are going to have more clean rooms, much more sophisticated targeting, and that's going to have big implications for TV.
Yeah, data was definitely sort of, if I could boil down the whole day, it's like the importance of data was just, it's always been important, but it's getting even more and more important. And there's all these different use cases mixed between good data and then also good creative, obviously, on the other end to drive good results. There was another media channel that was mentioned as being perhaps underinvested or just a missed opportunity, not just necessarily TV, which I think everyone is aware of its importance. But that was also gaming. You had Tess Gullis, who's from PhD. She made a really good point. She was only talking for like 5 minutes. It was one of those like rapid fire rounds of just what's the future of media. And she actually made the case
future of media in 5 minutes, go.
Yeah, go. Just give it to us. And she actually made the point that the present and not just the future is gaming. It was a funny point she made where we talk about Gen Z a lot and we just assume that they're like kids and teens. But actually, if you look at Gen Z or Gen Z,
it's pronounced Gen Z, Jack.
Yeah, well, whatever. She actually made the point that they're actually older teens and 20 somethings. I mean, I'm technically Gen Z. I'm at the very, very top end of Gen Z. The point being that we've grown up with gaming, and gaming's really important. And, we often talk about at previous events that gaming's been on sort of innovation budgets, and brands are like toying with it because they don't really know how to make it the most of the space necessarily, but that they're like way behind the ball. Like that should be a normal part of the media plan. If you're just trying to reach anyone under the age of like 27, 28, gaming should be part of the media plan. I thought it was a pretty interesting argument that she was making.
Yeah, but I felt like over the last few years I've just had this debate so many times. It's who are you calling up? The gaming companies have to lean into creating ad inventory, to work with the big agencies, to work directly with advertisers, and they have to lean into developing a system for investment. But
it's a process that's it's taken a very long time to develop, but did do recent reporting on Roblox specifically. So go have a look at that on the Media Leader. Roblox is definitely looking out to build its ad proposition, and they're huge. So
it's one of those things where it's like, at the end of the day, media content is the most important thing. Just you mustn't lose sight of if ads commercialization is going to ruin the gaming experience, then don't do it. And gaming generally before the internet was getting on very nicely indeed with selling cartridges and discs and people paying a lot of money to play these games.
But budgets have ballooned, and the cost of those now, not cartridges but just downloads, or some people still use compact discs to buy the physical media. I mean, the prices have barely changed over 20 years. It's still, and now it's like £70, 60, £70 to buy a game, but they're often on sale. And the cost of development is like massive. So they need to make more money from somewhere. And that's kind of where the advertising comes in.
Yeah.
But I take your point though.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually similar to, there was an interesting session that ITV did about Coronation Street and different product placement things that they've done, and it came actually within the same week as if you're a Coronation Street viewer, you might have seen that there were there was a shop that was kind of like due to be unveiled, and it was unveiled the last few days as Sainsbury's Argos, and on the one hand, it makes the show more believable because it's supposed to reflect real life to an extent, soap opera. But also, it's a big branded content thing when Argos is the show sponsor. It was Jason Spencer and Kate Brooks, who works on Coronation Street, and I really had this impression. It reminded me of the ITV Palooza upfronts that they do at the end of the year. The last one was, it's nearly a year ago. That's coming up again. But, just how salesy ITV is in all its kind of like public facing things. And I know that we're, this Future Media is a media and advertising conference, so you would expect that. But it really is a thread that's running through the organization where, you go back again in olden times, 20 years ago, where ITV, it's such a limited demand for TV ad sales inventory that they really didn't have to do a lot of selling, frankly. They're just kind of like processes of airtime, I think you more describe it as, whereas now it's so much more competitive. They have to be selling. And so you had this woman who kind of her job is as a producer and talking to the actors and developing the scripts, kind of talking to an advertising audience, media audience about their branded content, and it was really interesting. And Jason was like, "How many of you in the room are salespeople?" And a few people put their hand up, not many. And he kind of was making this point that we're not just selling by kind of selling to brands. The content creators are selling as well. This more lateral view of what it means to be commercial. And I just got this sense that there is something that's happened over ITV in the last few years. Maybe it's a Carolyn McCall direct thing, the CEO, but they're definitely so much more just commercial in terms of everything that they do. And it really comes out. Yeah, maybe it's just the nature of our business, but it feels like everyone is selling
something. I mean, that was actually the point that they made, that, as you mentioned. But like going back to Manchester City, they're selling their athletes. They're selling, it's not just that they're out to play a sport and be artful on the field or on the pitch, but they're also then sort of selling the brand and the personal brand. And it's the same. And it's sort of the fact that you mentioned that gaming has sort of been one of those areas that's resisted a little bit of this. The creep of constant sort of selling and advertising is quite interesting, but it's true that everyone it's such a competitive time that I feel like everyone is sort of forced to sell pretty direct now. Same thing with, we heard of it at tuning in from Radio Center. Radio has to do this as well, and using talent to also do that, not just whether that's a producer for Coronation Street or a player themselves on a football club, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And even when they had this award-winning storyline where one of the characters, they got motor neuron disease, and really they showed some clips and really kind of creative treatment of this poor character's journey and what had happened to him. And they talked about how we needed to sell that idea, and we needed to work with charities and partners, and we needed to make sure that we were telling that story in an authentic way. And even selling from that point of view, it just kind of forces you to think a little bit more about, well, it's even what we do when sometimes the content we create on the Media Leader, it's not like we just kind of like go into our ivory tower and we spit out all this content. A lot of it is talking to people in market and kind of asking them questions about, would you think this is interesting, or what do you think about that? You're testing these ideas. And I think in the modern media sales environment, and particularly when you're selling content, you have to kind of take people along with you for that journey. And I thought it was an interesting nugget that came through. And the best personal moment for me is I got to hold the BAFTA. They brought on stage. Right. They brought on stage their BAFTA award that Coronation Street won in, I think it was 2012. And my God, it is by far the heaviest award statuette I've ever lifted.
It looks heavy.
Oh my good! Like, I'm not even.
It looks like one of those like how in cartoons when like someone like picks something up and then like it's too heavy and their arms like drop to the floor, but their body still sort of stays up for a little moment and it's like delayed. That's what I thought was going to happen to you when you picked up the award.
Yeah. My weak little arms, I almost had a hernia. Yeah. So what else? So what else, Jack? Give me.
There was
one
one last thing. Yeah, there was one last thing that I thought was really interesting, because the event was happening the same day as this report came out from Stagwell. Stagwell did this study that looked at ad adjacency next to different news stories, because the common thought for some reason is that politics, war, crime, these are brand unsafe environments to advertise, versus like business or sports or something like that, entertainment. And the research said that wasn't true. And so Stagwell had some people up on stage to sort of talk through the research, and it was actually really quite interesting, because it essentially says that sort of brand safety efforts are kind of a load of crap in terms of, I mean, ad performance is just as well on a political news article as it is on entertainment gossip article. So why demonetize the political news article? That was sort of the question being raised.
But Jack, did we not have the CEO of Group M, I know he's just left, Christian Jewell, who stood up US Congress, and they were asking him why such little advertising money is going on news brands, and he said that advertisers don't want to spend on brand safe content because of all this negative news content.
Yeah, well, I mean, this research like directly undermines that statement. I mean, it might be true that brands it's certainly true that brands feel like iffy about it. They're worried, they don't want their ad associated with maybe negative coverage of something. But the point of the research is to say, in terms of media effectiveness, in terms of brand favorability, no one who's reading the article is associating your brand with whatever the content is in the article. Your brand is your brand, and they can sort of, a reader can discern what your brand is versus what the content of the article is. And I think it's really important. I mean, we had Alex Chisnick, who's the CCO of HarrisX, which conducted the research. It's a market research company that Stagwell owns. And he said that we're in a vicious cycle. where advertisers are pulling spend, which leads to less resource at the publication, which leads to worse coverage, which leads to advertisers wanting to spend less on it. I mean, round and round we go, and it's been going on like that for a really long time. And that we need to have a virtuous cycle where advertisers, sorry, Christian Jewell, need to be spending more. And it's not just that it's good for democracy and good for supporting journalism. It's good for their businesses as well, because the point that was being made by Chisnick was that there's actually a really strong business case to say, look, people that are reading a lot of news, sort of news junkie types, are not interacting with your brand enough. That there's an opportunity to reach people that are reading articles all day that you're not tapping into as a brand. And so and there's also, of course, the halo effect in terms of if you're on a trusted quality publication, people might think a little bit better of your brand. There's been loads of studies about that. So it was good to see not just like passion to say support journalism, but also like some data statistics to say there's no reason to not be spending on quality news publishers, regardless of whatever their coverage is about.
Okay. Jack, anything else from Manchester?
Only other thing is we're very excited to come back next year.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. And there's so many brands that are based outside of London. I think Future Media Manchester, this is definitely the start of doing more stuff up there. It was just really good to get out of London and talk to different people. And I think there's a lot more that's going to happen. Hopefully, with a different government, with a different mandate to build infrastructure, to develop, to have more meaningful relationships between business, government, and higher education as well. That's maybe something that doesn't get talked enough about, that so much of business can be stimulated by higher education and research and development. I just think there's a lot of talent that we need to keep within media, advertising, marketing, and we can't just rely on the London magnet to do that. So we're going to do our part of the media leader to help spread that magnet far and wide the country.
Thanks, Omar. Thank you all for listening out there. We'll see you next week.
Manchester, I love you.